Joining me on India Global, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, who is a Fellow of Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Thanks very much, Mr. Chaturvedi, for joining us on India Global. My first question to you, energy transition seems to be a key focus area as far as India is concerned. But the Prime Minister made an interesting point. He said energy transition has to be just, equitable and fair to the global south. What does it ultimately mean for India? And, I'll go one step further and ask, what does it actually mean for you and me?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on the show. Well, I think the first very important point is that energy transition cannot be at the cost of development. Development is paramount, and that's extremely, important. India is showcasing itself as a leader of the global south, right? And there are many challenges for the global south. It could be education, health, sanitation, water. There are a bunch of challenges. The fiscal space is limited, right? So it's not that India is not ramping up actions. It is already doing a lot more. Global South is doing a lot more in terms of climate change mitigation. But of course, in a limited fiscal space, you could only do so much, and that's why if developing South is kind of forced to enhance its ambition and mitigation actions, it means there is going to be some hit on development and growth,
right?
And that is not acceptable. So that is why I think the very important point that the Prime Minister made was that climate justice is critical. It has to be equitable and global carbon budget. He very interestingly also mentioned that developing South and developing countries need to have their rightful share and fair share in the global carbon budget, right?
Taking
And for
cue
all
from
of
that,
this,
Mr. Chaturvedi,
what is very important is finance. Yes.
And I was just coming to that point. One major breakthrough has been the fact that the loss and damage fund has been approved. Its operationalization is now imminent. How is that significant? What does it really mean? I mean, dumb it down for us, because it is something that really impacts us all. What does the operationalization, the possible operationalization of this fund means?
Sure, great. So very important question. First of all, the finance debate is about three large buckets. One is mitigation, then adaptation, and loss and damage, right? So what does loss and damage mean? So the floods that we are seeing, right? For example, the Kerala floods. And there is increasing evidence that many of these climate disasters have a climate angle, right? And this has been a making of the developed world because of their historical emissions. So it is kind of their responsibility in some way that the world and especially developing nations are facing the brunt of climate change, right? So the loss and damage fund essentially seeks to aid the developing world and especially the most vulnerable developing economies in terms of recovering from such disasters which are climate disasters. We are not really talking about an earthquake, because earthquake is at least till now not been kind of associated with the climate change. We are talking about climate impact events like cyclones, floods, droughts, heat waves, those kinds of things which could impact economies and people at a wide scale. So that's why the important part here is that it has to be, there has to be some support for recovery. So the notion of recovery from this finance is very important. And that's why loss and damage fund, that's what exactly it seeks to do. That's the first part. The second part is operationalization. What does it mean? Well, the demand of fund for this fund has been very long-standing demand over like almost 2 decades now.
Right.
Operationalization means, well, there is a host, which now it has been agreed that the World Bank will be the interim host for this fund. The second is that the developing world should have kind of rapid access. We should not be stuck with the World Bank bureaucracy, right?
Okay,
If there
that's
is
an
an
important
event
point
disaster,
there, Mr. Chaturvedi. And you spoke also about recovery. And for recovery, what's also important is fixing accountability. Do you think
yes.
we are a step closer to fixing accountability as far as climate change is concerned? Because there have been many conventions, but ultimately you still see the global south, the developing nations paying the price for the wrongs done by the West.
Yes. So I think the historical responsibility principle is already enshrined in the UN. So in that sense, that accountability is already established. But what has not been established is that they have been consistently kind of taking targets and not delivered. That accountability has not been established. And one of CEW's recent analysis also shows that under Kyoto Protocol, whatever targets that developed world countries had, it was like if you ignore COVID, was a very different year. But pre-COVID, let's say the target was around 18% emission reduction as compared to 1990 baseline between 1919 and 2020. So 18% was the target of emission reduction. The most of the industrialized countries actually just achieved around 3.5-4%. Right. So basically, you kind of you say in principle that we are okay with the historical responsibility argument. We are also willing to take these targets, but they actually don't do anything.
Right.
Similar on the climate finance front.
So,
there was
equitable
there was
and
$100 billion
just energy transition, and of course, a step closer to climate equity is what perhaps seems to be the biggest takeaway as far as this climate summit is concerned. Thanks very much, Mr. Chaturvedi, for joining us with that very important perspective there. But there have also been several controversies on the sidelines of the COP28. Even before it began, and perhaps soon after UAE took over presidency of COP28, questions have been raised about the balance between energy needs and climate commitments. Well, UAE is among the world's 10 largest oil producers, and even before the climate conference began, UAE Sultan Al Jaber is and has been in the eye of the storm. Well, he has forcefully denied a report alleging his nation planning to use this summit to strike oil and gas deals. Is there any truth to that? Well, here is a report.
As the COP28 host, the United Arab Emirates plan to discuss possible natural gas and other commercial deals ahead of UN climate talks. An investigation by the BBC and the Centre for Climate Reporting has revealed. Now, this report cited leaked documents which it said were prepared for the COP28 president-designate Sultan Al Jaber for meetings with at least 27 governments.
These allegations are false, not true, incorrect, and not accurate. And it's an attempt to undermine the work of the COP28 presidency. I respect the fact that we have been clear, open, and clean, and honest and transparent on how we're going to conduct this COP process.
Sultan Al Jaber is head of state oil giant Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, and the UAE is a major crude producer and a leading member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Al Jaber has not committed ADNOC to cutting its oil production. He has extended an invitation to oil and gas companies and prioritized private sector climate solutions. The nomination of Mr. Jaber to lead the climate talks has drawn criticism from climate activists. They are concerned he will be unable to take the neutral stance required of a COP president. Critics, from Greta Thunberg to Al Gore, say Al Jaber is just a stalking horse for the fossil fuel industry's continuing efforts to stall the global climate agenda. Al Jaber, meanwhile, says he's uniquely positioned to reconcile the many interests in the climate fight. More than 100 members of the European Parliament and the US Congress declared in May that Al Jaber had severely jeopardized the COP process. Al Jaber is not wrong that the world requires cold-eyed realism, but no one knows where his version of realism will lead yet. For its part, the UAE has pledged to reduce its emissions by 19% by 2030, using 2019 as the baseline. Recently, though, under Al Jaber's leadership, the state-owned oil company announced plans to increase production by a total of more than 7 billion barrels, a move that clearly strains against this pledge. Parmeshwar Bava for NDTV.